Looking out the window, I saw only an endless gray-white blanket of clouds, dense as a cotton blanket, and so thick that it seemed to have no end or edge. There is no sign of land or horizon, just a dim light barely breaking through the layers of clouds, giving the whole picture an almost unreal, frozen feel. I felt like I was in an endless white vacuum, surrounded by a soft, but still frightening abyss. After examining the instrument panel, I checked heading, position, and altitude one by one, looking from one indicator to another. Each indicator glowed a calm, even light, reassuring me that, at least on this side, everything was under control. For now, but my heart still pounded. Flying blind, without visual references, always caused slight tension, forcing me to be even more attentive to every instrument. It was like a completely different type of piloting, when you don't rely on your eyes, but trust only iron mechanisms that tell you where you are and where you are going. When my eyes fell on the VOR settings, I noticed that the needle was tilted to the right. Damn, that's all I needed. Now you have to correct the direction again and catch this damned arrow, leveling the course. Mentally cursing, I took a moment to look at the map to see how serious this deviation was, and saw that the course was off by 5 degrees. 5 degrees, which can cost you the loss of several precious minutes, and maybe even a deviation from the intended route by tens of kilometers. How long have I been flying with this error? This question pricked my mind like a needle, forcing me to look again and again for the moment when everything went wrong. I checked the map again and realized that I had made this mistake at the very start, a small, almost imperceptible deviation of 5 degrees, which, however, could have played a role, given the strong crosswind that had been following me from the very beginning of the flight. My course was initially correct, but this could have been the effect of wind drift, which so insidiously and often interferes with the plans of pilots. When you read reports about light aircraft crashes, the cause is almost always the same: pilot error. A small miscalculation, a seemingly insignificant detail left unattended, and then something simple and familiar turns into a fatal mistake. Damn, I thought, now I too may be at risk of becoming one of those grim statistics where the cause is the human factor. Pilot error. The very thought of it made me tense up internally. It always seems so far away until you realize that right now you are on the verge of getting into these numbers. My name is John Joseph Larouche. A few hours ago, I took to the skies from a small private airfield in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, heading home to Seattle, Washington. Initially, I was flying along the route of I-90, and that ribbon of asphalt under the wing kept me steady. But soon everything changed as soon as I entered a band of dense low clouds. Now I had lost my visual reference, that very highway, and found myself cut off from the usual world, locked in my cabin, surrounded by thick white fog. Now, by my calculations and hopes, I was somewhere around 1,500 feet above Snoqualmie Pass. This was not the best place to lose confidence in your location. I knew I had to be high enough to avoid any danger of colliding with the tops of the hills and ridges that crossed the pass. But when you fly by instruments, trusting only the readings on the panel, there is always a shadow of doubt. You can never be absolutely sure that everything is going perfectly according to plan. At the moment, at least, I knew that everything was in order with the main parameters. There was enough fuel, the plane was maintaining a stable altitude, the course was correct and leading to the destination. And yet, outside the window, a dense white fog surrounded me, as if I was wrapped in an endless blanket of clouds. Damn, it seems like this was one of those cases where you could really say I was in perfect shape. I thought about my wife, Joanne, who was now most likely waiting at home with the children, unaware of the cloud traps her husband was stuck in. We had a fight before I left for Idaho. She didn't want me to fly. She asked me to stay, saying that the trip was not worth it. But I, tired of her criticism, asked if she liked our house, cozy and expensive, if she liked her Lexus, if she wanted the children to continue studying in that prestigious private school for which we pay so much. Joanne fell silent, but her gaze was full of hidden rage. She knew full well that I wouldn't back down, and before she turned and walked away, she simply called me a bastard. I just grinned, wordlessly picked up my bags and walked out the door without deigning to glance at her, without hearing the final usual wish to be careful, and yet it seemed to me that somewhere behind her a muffled sob sounded. You see, less than a month ago I found out that my beloved, my darling Joanne was secretly having an affair, and with no one else but with my brother, my best friend, the person I always trusted. Now, of course, he was dead to me, no, not literally, but lost forever, as if he really was dead. Their secret affair began while I was on a regular business trip in Vancouver, British Columbia. My work required constant travel to different cities, meetings with clients and partners, negotiations that sometimes lasted for hours and left me completely exhausted. Commercial flights only aggravated this fatigue. Endless queues, delays, security checks, inconvenient connections, all this drained the last of my strength. At some point, I realized that for my schedule, a private jet would be not just a convenience, but a necessity. And then I made a serious investment, buying my own old, but time-tested twin-engine Piper Comanche. For most, it may not have been a dream car, but for me, a pilot with years of experience, this Comanche became a faithful assistant. A confident and reliable aircraft, which, like me, was tempered by time and difficulties. I started flying almost from childhood, and the skies have always been like a second home for me. My father, who himself spent thousands of hours in the air, opened this world to me when I was only 14. He often took me into the cockpit with him, initiated me into the secrets of controlling the aircraft, showed me every indicator on the instrument panel, and explained the nuances of flights in different weather conditions. These hours with him in the air were a real school of life for me and forever made me fall in love with the sky. As soon as I turned 18, the first thing I did was pass all the required exams and received my first license to fly a single-engine airplane. But I didn't stop there. Every time I had the opportunity, I took a new program and improved my skills. First, I received clearance to fly by instruments, which allowed me to confidently fly in poor visibility conditions. Then he mastered twin-engine aircraft and even later, seaplanes. Now I had everything I needed to cope with any situation in the air. Only once did I find myself on the verge of a disaster, and I still remember this incident with a chill in my chest. I then practiced recovering from a spin over Elliott Bay, practicing skills that could save my life if I were ever caught in such a situation in a real flight. Having reached an altitude of 6,000 feet, I sharply raised the nose, and when the light but capricious Cessna 150 began to lose lift, I pushed the rudder pedal, sending the plane into a steep, precisely timed spin. Each time he rushed down, twisting into a neat rotation, as if trying to turn over in the air. Then came the most crucial moment. I lowered the nose, trying to restore the air flow over the wings, sharply pressed the opposite rudder to stop the rotation, and slowly pulled the steering wheel until the Cessna returned to level flight. After a few successful iterations, I headed back to Tacoma Narrows Airfield, exhaling and patting the dashboard in satisfaction, as if the car had earned some praise too. But it was there, on the familiar strip, that I almost met my own end. By the time of landing, a strong crosswind had arisen, and although I confidently adjusted the approach, this gust of wind was much more treacherous. It suddenly picked up a light aircraft, and despite all my efforts, I was blown away from the runway. The front wheel of the plane stuck into the gravel on the side of the road. The plane sharply nosed down, and the next moment I was hanging upside down, held only by my seat belt. These few seconds spent upside down in the cockpit seemed like an eternity to me. I heard rescuers already approaching outside, and less than a minute later a rescue team appeared at the scene of the accident. They quickly got to the cabin and carefully cut me out of the straps, helping me get out. Luckily, the plane didn't catch fire, and apart from a few scratches and a couple of bruises, I escaped with only a slight scare. But a much stronger test awaited me later. When my father found out about the accident and the death of his beloved Cessna, it seemed to me that it would be easier to end up with broken bones in a hospital room than to withstand his anger and disappointment. For him, this Cessna was something like a member of the family, and I, in his eyes, was the one who destroyed it through negligence. I chuckled, remembering that same Cessna. After the accident, the father did not leave it broken on the side of the road. He did his best to bring this little plane back to life, restoring it as meticulously as if he were treating an old friend. He replaced every damaged bolt, polished the cockpit, repainted the body, and within months the Cessna was back to its original form, ready to take to the skies. Even more surprising to me was that 3 years later, on my 21st birthday, my father gave me the keys to this Cessna 150. That day, I experienced almost childish delight, unable to believe that the very plane on which I studied and which, in fact, sank, now belonged to me. Later, after he left, I learned that my father had always planned to give me this car, making it a symbol of my independence and growing up. It became more than just a reminder of him, of our hours together in the sky, of how he taught me, trusting me more and more every year. A sudden jerk brought me back to reality. The Comanche shook so much that my fingers involuntarily gripped the steering wheel tighter. The turbulence intensified, and the plane was thrown up and down, like a toy in the hands of an invisible giant. Damn, I thought, maybe I should try to gain altitude and get out of these thick clouds. Before leaving Coeur d'Alene, the forecast confidently called for partly cloudy skies at 17,000 feet, but what surrounded me now certainly did not look like broken clouds. Instead, it was a continuous layer of thick fog that seemed to stretch on forever. The plane shook again, as if a huge palm had thrown it into the air, and in the next seconds it began to fall rapidly until the flow of unstable air evened out. The wind beat angrily on the aluminum casing, as if warning that this was not the end. Despite all the bumps and shaking, I tenaciously stayed on course, my eyes never leaving the instrument panel, where indicators flickered, confirming that the plane was still in the right position. After checking the fuel gauges, I was convinced that the tanks were almost full, and this calmed me down a little. The engines hummed with a low, measured sound, and this even rhythm instilled in me a feeling of reliability. My breathing became a little labored, and I took a deep breath, trying to control the tension. Holding my breath for a few seconds, I slowly exhaled, feeling my body gradually releasing tension, but my mind remained collected and ready for any surprises. Just as suddenly as it had started, the turbulence disappeared. I was still flying on instruments, but at least for now I was in calm air. My thoughts went back to Joanne and that fateful day. I returned from Vancouver earlier than planned. A meeting with important clients was canceled at the last minute, and my trip was suddenly cut short. At first I was annoyed by this, but then I thought I had some free time and decided to surprise Joanne. I dialed my home number to tell her that I was returning and to suggest we have dinner together, because such an opportunity was rarely taken advantage of. The phone rang several times, but to my surprise, the answering machine came on. Joanne should have been home with the twins by now. Strange, I thought. Perhaps she decided to go out on business, taking the girls with her. Probably stopped at the mall or bought groceries for a small family dinner. I chuckled as I imagined my girls, my three little princesses, each with their own unique personalities, twisting Joanne into buying them something special. The older twin, Jenny, was always asking for extra sweets, and the younger, Emma, was always asking for something horse-related. Deciding not to interrupt their day, I dialed Joanne's number again on her cell phone to let her know I'd be home early. However, there was no answer, either the phone remained silent. With slight concern, I left a message, just in case, reminding her that I planned to return earlier today and hoped that I would hear her clear voice before I was on the doorstep. When I arrived at our house around 7:30 in the evening, I was greeted by silence and darkness. All the windows were gloomily dark, not a single glimmer of light inside. I felt an unpleasant feeling in my chest. By this time Joanne and the twins should have been home, and usually at this time warm light was already spreading through the house. My heart sank. Had something serious happened? Maybe an accident on the road or something else. I got out of the car and, clutching the keys in my palm, hurriedly walked to the door. Having opened the lock, I went inside, peering into the darkness, ready for any, even the worst, scenario. I walked throughout the house, looking into every room. Everything was in its place, without signs of haste or disorder. Only a ringing emptiness. Where could they have gone? All that was left was to call and find out. I dialed my mother's number, hoping that perhaps Joanne had decided to stop by her parents' house, but my mother said she didn't know anything. She assured me that it was likely that Joanne and the girls were just delayed, but her words did not completely calm me down. In an attempt to find some kind of answer, I called Joanne's mother. The answer was unexpected. The twins were staying with her for the weekend, and she was sure that Joanne should have returned home long ago. With slight concern, her mother asked if I could let her know as soon as I found Joanne, and I promised to do so, but ending the conversation only made me more worried. Where could she be? I took out my phone, checked my answering machine, but found only my own message, left earlier as I said that I was returning home early and suggested spending the evening together. There was only one explanation left. Maybe she was with Moira, her best friend. Joanne always turned to her in difficult moments, and if something happened, it would completely explain her absence. I dialed Joanne's number again, now with more noticeable anxiety, but again received no answer. This time I didn't leave any message. I just froze for a few seconds, peering into the darkness outside the window, not knowing what to think. Then he tried to call Moira's home number, hoping that maybe they had simply forgotten their phones and were spending the evening together. But even there, the phone was silent. At that moment, I made perhaps the worst decision of my life to surprise my brother David by dropping by unannounced. David was a lieutenant commander stationed at the Bangor submarine base just outside Bremerton. He was a man accustomed to discipline and strict routines, which did not allow us to see each other often, despite the fact that the distance between us was small. He lived off base in a modest apartment just a few miles from our parents' house, which was convenient for the short breaks between trips to sea. David was preparing for another mission on one of those nuclear submarines that he talked about with barely noticeable pride, and at the same time with full awareness of the seriousness of his work. It was a Los Angeles-class boat, fast and stealthy attack submarines, true underwater hunters. He once said that such submarines can go on patrol for several months, diving to enormous depths and leaving behind only an invisible trace. He was reserved in describing their capabilities, their power and maneuverability, but I knew that his work was fraught with constant tension. While I was driving to David, I couldn't help but feel disappointed that Joanne had disappeared somewhere. But the thought that I could spend the evening with my brother at least smoothed out this feeling a little. It had been a long time since David and I had sat down over a beer together, and I even felt a small wave of anticipation. Having arrived at his house, I parked in the only free space, turned off the engine, and was already reaching for the door, but suddenly froze in place, as if an icy wave had washed over me from head to toe. After a couple of seconds, I realized what I was seeing. Joanne's Lexus was parked a few parking spaces away from me. There was no doubt. I immediately recognized our silver-blue SUV and that stupid pink bumper sticker that annoyed me so much and made her so happy. My twins are excellent students. My heart began to beat with redoubled force. What the hell was she doing here at David's house? Numb, I locked the car and quietly moved towards the complex. My attention was focused on his door, and I tried to stay in such a way as not to be noticed. I walked up the stairs and stopped at the door, almost holding my breath. From this angle, I could see the entrance to his apartment, the kitchen window, and the door leading to a small terrace. A soft light poured from inside, breaking through the drawn, thick curtains. There was music inside, muffled but rhythmic sounds, like a calm, intimate melody meant for two. I peered into the dim shadows that flickered on the curtain like elusive silhouettes. At some point, the two silhouettes froze and began to move closer, head to head, body to body, as if they were slowly spinning in a dance. Then I noticed how their faces came closer to each other, and against the background of the light, they merged into one silhouette, as if in a kiss. Panting, I crept to the kitchen window and looked through the open blinds. From this angle, I could see straight through the kitchen and into the living room. Holding back my shock, I saw how intimate my wife was with my brother. At first, I was going to knock down his damn door, but then I decided to play differently. I don't know why, but I didn't want them to know that I caught them. My hands were shaking, but I took out my mobile phone. My eyes remained glued to the picture in front of me. I dialed my brother's number and heard his phone ring. They stopped and both looked at the phone. He whispered something to Joanne and went to answer. When he saw the number, he froze and said something to my wife, who covered her mouth with her hands. He hesitated, but still answered. "Hey, brother." "What happened?" he said. "Hey, Dave, how are you? Let's go have a beer and play some pool." I tried my best to hide the rage that threatened to burst out. I saw him cover the microphone with his hand, look at Joanne, and tell her what I suggested. She closed her eyes and nodded. She quickly ran to the sofa, grabbed her clothes, and ran out of the room. Johnny, sounds great, but give me about 20 minutes to get ready. I thought you were away for the weekend." This was his second mistake of the evening. How could he know that I would be gone for the weekend? No, the clients canceled the appointment, so I came back early. I tried to call Joanne, but she wasn't home and wasn't answering my calls. "Have you seen her by any chance?" He hesitated before answering. "No, I haven't spoken to Joanne in a long time." "What time will you arrive?" By this time, Joanne had returned to the living room, dressed and visibly shaken. "She's probably with Moira. I'll be with you in 15 to 20 minutes. Be prepared to lose. See you." I saw David, still naked, turn to my wife and convey to her the contents of our conversation. She cried, pressing her hands to her lips. He said something and tried to kiss her. She shook her head and stepped back, and I saw his shoulders slump. Joanne headed for the door, so I quickly moved away and hid behind a tall bush in the shade. The door opened, and she walked out, followed by David, dressed in an old, tattered blue robe. I recognized the robe. He stole it from the Edgewater Hotel in Seattle. We stayed there once in the hope of getting the same room that the Beatles stayed in, but unfortunately it was occupied. Instead, David kept the robe. He stood at the door, looked at her, and she looked at the ground. "Joanne, can we see each other again, please?" he asked. "I don't know, David. I love John and don't want to lose him. Please don't do this. If he finds out, he will be hurt. Please, Joanne, I want you. I need you, and I know you want me. We can try again. When he's away, I know you want it as much as I do." My wife looked at him, her face expressing confusion. "David, I can't do this." She turned around and ran away from the apartment. David, with anger on his face, looked after her for a few seconds, then closed the door. When about 15 minutes had passed, I came out of hiding and knocked on his door. He opened it with a wide, smug smile on his face. I couldn't help myself. I hit him. "Johnny, what the hell?" "Listen, bastard, if I see you near Joanne, I'll kill you. From now on, you are dead to me. You are no longer my brother. Don't talk to me, don't call, don't write, no letters, nothing. When I visit my parents, you shouldn't be there. I don't know what to do with Joanne, but if you try to see her or talk to her, I swear to God I will find you. Understood? Do you understand me?" "Yes, yes," he muttered. Looking up, I saw a photograph of us on the wall, where he hugged me by the shoulder and smiled. I took the photo and, looking straight at him, smashed it against the wall and left. Now I had to deal with Joanne. Suddenly, the plane shook so violently that I could barely hold on to the controls. The turbulence returned with renewed vigor, as if nature had decided to test my patience and endurance. A sharp jolt threw the plane sideways, and my maps, tablet, and navigation notes, neatly folded on the seat to the right, scattered across the cabin. I tried to catch them with one hand, but before I could grab anything, I felt a strong blow. The plane was jerked towards the window, and I hit my head on the counter, heard a ringing in my ears, and lost my orientation for a moment. My vision blurred for a second, but I blinked several times and, gathering myself, stared at the dashboard, checking the readings. All the equipment, fortunately, worked flawlessly, and the autopilot maintained a stable course, but something was wrong. The left side of my face seemed warm and strangely wet. Running my hand over my cheek, I saw bright red spots on my fingers. Damn it, this is the last thing I need right now. Quickly assessing the situation, I reached under the right seat, felt for the first aid kit, and took out a small compress. The cabin shook again, and I almost dropped it, but I pressed the compress tightly to the wound, feeling how the cold instantly began to relieve the pain. With one hand, I pressed the compress, and with the other, groping for a bandage in the first aid kit, I tried to cope with the turbulence that continued to throw the plane from side to side. Holding the compress in place, I carefully wrapped the bandage around my head, trying to secure it so that the compress would not move with the next push. The autopilot continued to stay on course, and the monotonous hum of the engines encouraged me as I tightened the bandage, feeling the adrenaline release little by little, leaving only a dull ache and a stubborn desire to cope with it all. The plane continued to shake, and I decided it was time to try to find a calmer airflow. I pulled the yoke towards me and felt the plane slowly gaining altitude. After about 20 minutes, the Comanche stopped shaking. I had risen to 10,500 feet. I reached for a small metal bottle of oxygen. At this altitude, it may already be needed, although I doubted that it would really be needed. Still surrounded by the damn clouds, I decided to stay at this altitude for a while before returning to my intended course. Fortunately, the air here was much calmer. I reached down, picked up the cards and tablet, and returned them to the seat. When I looked up, the magnificent clear blue of the sky was revealed to me. I got out of the clouds. Simply wonderful, I thought. But if you look down, the picture was completely different. The layer of clouds was dense and extended for many kilometers. I decided to stay at this altitude for another 15 to 30 minutes before starting my descent. After checking the instruments, I noticed that the bore needle was back in place. My father always insisted that I install a GPS, but I was too stubborn to keep up with technology. Now I regret it, it would have been much easier with GPS. My thoughts went back to Joanne and the beginning of our story. We met in college, our freshman year at the University of Washington. I then studied programming and computer repair, delved into the world of technology, and at the same time took courses in aeronautics. I always dreamed of the sky, and aviation was something of a personal passion. Joanne was passionate about art, immersing herself in painting with such inspiration that it seemed that some kind of creative energy was always hovering around her. Her paintings were bold, bright, and the teachers themselves called her promising. We were completely different, as if from different worlds, but, as often happens, our paths crossed in an unexpected way. One evening, my friends persuaded me to go with them to a student party. It was one of those crowded, noisy parties where it's almost impossible to talk, and there are only people around, dancing and music that makes your ears clog. I didn't feel quite at ease there, took a bottle of beer, and, deciding to give my friends the freedom to hunt girls, I found myself a secluded place outside the house, away from the noise and crowds. Sitting alone and sipping a cool beer, I listened as the sounds of the party spilled out loud laughter coming through the walls, discordant shouts and music that was muffled, and then burst through the windows again. Without a doubt, my friends were already quite tipsy, and I grinned, imagining their drunken antics and attempts to impress the students. "Hey, do you mind if I join?" A melodic voice suddenly brought me out of my thoughts. I raised my head and met the most expressive blue eyes I could imagine. For a second I froze, as if I had fallen into some kind of magical stupor, as if time had stopped around us. She was so beautiful that all the sounds of the party faded and remained somewhere far away, like a background for this moment. Her long brown hair fell in soft waves, and a slight smile played on her lips, as if she knew full well what impression she had made. The laughter that suddenly escaped her lips finally brought me to my senses, and I heard her say with a hint of concern, "Excuse me, are you okay?" At that moment, she lightly touched my shoulder, as if checking that I really had not lost touch with reality. Her touch was light, almost weightless, but I felt the blood rush to my face, and I knew I had to say something. "Sorry, it's just, I think I was under a powerful spell," I muttered, looking away and feeling childishly embarrassed. She tilted her head slightly and repeated, puzzled, "A spell?" Her voice sounded soft, with a hint of curiosity, and it seemed to fuel my embarrassment. I collected my thoughts, smiled, and decided to answer with a little more confidence. "It's your fault," I said, desperately trying to make it sound easy and natural. "My fault?" she asked again, now with more obvious interest, as if trying to understand what I meant. I met her gaze again, holding it a little longer. "Yes," I confirmed softly. "These eyes. It is impossible to resist such a charming look." She smiled, and I was completely lost. Although the darkness was gathering around her, her joy was so radiant that even the light of the street lamps seemed pale in comparison with her energy. There was something light and warm at the same time in that smile, as if she could illuminate everything around her with just one glance. After we exchanged names, she called herself Joanne Marie Jardine, and I thought her name was perfect for this glowing girl with blue eyes and an infectious laugh. She sat down next to me on the cold step, not paying attention to the evening coolness, and we began to talk about everything in the world. Joanne admitted that she doesn't really like loud student parties. Her friends persuaded her to go with them. Otherwise, she would have preferred to spend the evening sketching in her room. I chuckled, saying that I had been dragged here almost by force, and we both laughed, as if we had found something in common on this random evening. The conversation flowed easily, as if we had known each other for a long time, and, to my surprise, time flew by. We talked about books and films, her dreams of creating her own exhibition, and my plans to work on technologies that would one day be useful in aviation. By the time she suddenly looked at her watch and noticed how late it was, night had already completely enveloped the campus, and we had to say goodbye. Joanne stood up, sighed, and said it was time for her to head back to the dorm. I immediately offered to accompany her, and she looked at me for a long time before quietly agreeing. As we approached her dorm building, we stopped under a street lamp that illuminated her face with a soft yellow light. We were both silent, as if we could not find words to express something important, but elusive. I looked into her bright, piercing blue eyes and felt how I was consumed by this moment. And then she slowly stepped towards me, wrapped her arms around me, and, standing on her tiptoes, unexpectedly touched my lips with a light but sensual kiss. I froze, stunned, feeling the warmth from her kiss spreading throughout my body. And before I could say a word, she quickly turned around and disappeared into the building, leaving me standing there, confused and happily stunned. On our fourth date, she invited me to her room. Joanne whispered that her neighbor was away for the weekend and playfully batted her long eyelashes. I remember standing in front of the door, and she took my hand and gently pulled me inside. As soon as the door closed, we hugged and started kissing. She pulled away and locked the door. "John," she looked at me with excitement in her eyes. I, "I've never done this, please. Be gentle." I remember almost laughing. Damn, what a mistake that would have been. She would have misunderstood if she had not known that this was also my first time. "I love you, Joanne," I said, barely containing my emotions. Joanne gently stroked my cheek and kissed my forehead before whispering, "I love you so much, John." 2 years later, Joanne and I got married. It was a simple but beautiful ceremony. Our loved ones and friends gathered on the shore of a lake surrounded by tall pine trees, and it seemed as if nature itself was celebrating with us. We exchanged vows in the open air, promising to always support each other. Those moments were full of love and serenity, and I was sure that on that day we began a story that would last a lifetime. Another 4 years passed, and Joanne gave me two beautiful twin girls, Jody and Samantha. These tiny creatures have become our little miracle. I watched as Joanne rocked them in her arms and could not help but think that life was good, that we had everything I had ever dreamed of, a house, children, and a strong union that seemed unshakable. We went through sleepless nights with babies, experienced their first steps and words together, rejoiced at every success. I thought that our marriage was a secure fortress, based on deep love and trust, cemented not only by affection for each other, but also for our daughters. We had difficulties like everyone else, but I sincerely believed that we would survive any challenge. I never thought for a moment that Joanne would betray that trust. Cheating seemed like something distant, foreign to us, something that happens somewhere in other families, but not in ours. I knew I would have to make a decision about us. The girls, Jody and Sammy, felt that something was wrong between their mother and me, and I could see how it affected them. They increasingly stayed with their grandparents, trying to escape the tense atmosphere that reigned in the house. Damn, damn, damn. Why did she do this to me? Why did my brother, my own brother, betray me? It's been 4 weeks since I found out everything. When I left David's apartment, I didn't go home. Instead, I found a nearby bar and drank myself into oblivion. When the bar closed, I had a hard time getting to my car. I managed to open the door and plop myself down in the seat, but before I could even put the key in the ignition, some damn meddling guy grabbed them. I fell out of the car and, staggering, demanded, "Give me my keys, son of a bitch, otherwise I'll smear your face." I couldn't really see his face, but this freak asked for it. I swung my fist, swinging my fist as if in slow motion. I woke up on the sofa in the living room of our house. A blinding light came through the window, hitting my face. I had a terrible hangover, the worst I've ever had in my entire life. Joanne sat across from me with teary red eyes. "John, I'm so sorry. I can't even." She didn't have time to finish. David must have told her what happened. "Joanne, please. I don't want to hear it. Don't say a word. Don't look at me." "John, I love those." "Shut up. I told you not to say a word to me. Don't even dare tell me that you love me. I no longer have a loving wife, just as I no longer have a brother." I looked at her intently, as if challenging her. "Say at least one word." She looked at me in shock, then got up from her chair and ran into our bedroom, slamming the door, and I heard her cry bitterly. My heart ached for her, but my pride demanded that I repay her for what she had done. We still haven't spoken since I left on this trip. I moved into the guest room and left the house every morning before she got up and didn't return until late in the evening. It was even worse over the weekend. I spent most of the day either in the office or working in the garden, and Joanne was in the bedroom or taking care of the children most of the time. We only crossed paths for a few minutes while she was preparing dinner for the twins. Every time our eyes met, she immediately lowered her eyes, and we both turned away, and the girls always noticed this. As for David, well, he took the easy way out. Somewhere off the coast of North Korea, on a nuclear submarine, he escaped this situation. At the insistence of our parents, we met once. After a heated exchange of words, we came to a mutual understanding. He is no longer my brother. He was dead to me. My mother took it the hardest. I didn't want to tell her why we fell apart and David went sailing again. But in the end, I did explain what happened between me, Joanne, and David. She could not and did not want to believe that David could do this to me, his younger brother. In desperation, I suggested she call Joanne to confirm. She did just that. After that, I never heard my parents talk about David again. With Joanne's mother, it was a different story. She somehow understood from conversations with her granddaughters that something had gone wrong at home, and the girls asked me to call their grandmother. I didn't just call, I met her in person. When Joanne picked up the twins, I waited until Joanne's mother, Anne, was alone and knocked on her door. I didn't go into details, but somehow she guessed that her daughter was the cause of all the trouble. I didn't deny it, but I didn't reveal what exactly happened. I just said that her daughter and I are going through a difficult period, and I don't know how it will end. Anna hugged me, asking me not to leave Joanne. She is sure that her daughter truly loves me, that everything she has done is tearing her apart. Anna also reminded me of children. Girls love and need both parents. I returned her hug and thanked her for everything she had done for us and for the children, and then left. I knew that sooner or later I would have to talk to Joanne and find out why she did this. A small interruption in the steady hum of the engines brought me back to reality. What was that? I listened to the sound of the engines, but heard nothing else. Feeling it was time to descend to 7,000 feet, I pointed the plane down and looked out the window again at the clouds below. To my relief, the layer of clouds broke, and I could see the land below. The night panorama was mesmerizing, a soft network of streetlights scattered on the ground, spreading out in the form of a golden web, as if the city had spread its luminous threads across the dark earth. It was already late, the sun had long disappeared behind the distant mountain ranges, but the last colors of the sunset were still flickering on the horizon, creating a graceful transition from warm orange and soft pink to the calm bluish gray that colored the clouds in the upper layers of the atmosphere. The skies seemed to dissolve, mixing these pastel colors in an endless heavenly watercolor, before which any art faded. I admired this picture, full of peace and grandeur, and it was moments like these that reminded me why I love the sky and flying so much. Watching this transition from day to night, seeing the world from above, where its turmoil seems distant and unimportant, was worth spending hours in the air for. I was still over the mountain range. Mount Rainier was far to the south. Through a gap in the clouds, I could barely make out Seattle, and the glowing light of the Space Needle was like a small bright point. Soon I would turn right and fly towards Tacoma Narrows Airport. Grrrr. Puff, roar, the engine began to cough, with a crash and black smoke escaping from under the hood of the left engine. I quickly inspected the instruments, but found no signs of a problem. There was enough fuel, and the oil pressure sensor seemed to be normal too. But no, the oil pressure in the left engine dropped sharply. Damn it, this wasn't enough yet. I began my descent to 6,000 feet and found myself blind again, plunging into the damned clouds. Brrrr. Bang. I heard the left engine begin to choke and watched as its propeller began to stop. I shut off the fuel supply and disconnected the magneto on the damaged engine. I used the opposite rudder to compensate for the roll caused by the operation of only one engine. The Comanche shuddered, but at least it continued to fly straight. I contacted the control tower in Seattle and issued a distress call. Mayday, mayday. This is a twin-engine Comanche N70-3251. I'm running on one engine. I switched the transponder to emergency. I didn't have time to finish. All electronics turned off. Damn it, what the... I stared in horror at the dashboard. Everything had gone dark. The radio, all electronic devices, lighting everything went out. I noticed with horror how the right engine began to choke. Its propeller also began to stop. Damn, this is already really bad, I muttered through clenched teeth. I was losing altitude, slowly emerging from the clouds, but I managed to keep the plane level. I knew I only had a few minutes left before I emerged from the cloud layer. I struggled to keep the plane in a smooth glide. I kept my nose just above the stall point. And so, I came out of the clouds. Having estimated the altitude by eye, I realized that I was somewhere at the level of maybe 2,500 feet. Looking down, I saw that I was above a wooded hill with not a single clearing ahead. "Joanne," I blurted out as I thought about my wife and daughters. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, struggling for control to keep the plane gliding. "Fly the plane," I heard my father's voice as I watched the treetops approach. It was almost completely dark, and the tree line was a threatening silhouette. With the engines off, I could hear the wind whistling around the fuselage as I tried to keep myself from stalling. Slap. I probably felt the tops of the trees sliding along the bottom of the plane. I looked out the window and gasped when I saw a huge dark silhouette right in front of me. I grabbed the steering wheel, my heart sank in pain, and I shouted, "Joanne, forgive me. Lord, forgive me." The last thing I heard was a heartbreaking crunch of metal, and everything plunged into darkness. The sky was devoid of color. Dark clouds erased any attempts to color the world around us with something even remotely reminiscent of joy. She looked at the waters of the bay, tears flowing down her cheeks, falling from her trembling chin, while the ocean roared, throwing white foam onto the crests of the waves. She was alone on this tiny stretch of beach, sitting on a small grassy knoll with her arms wrapped around her knees. "Johnny, my sweet Johnny, I'm so sorry," she whispered, wiping away tears and sobbing. "God, it's been 2 days since he disappeared," she thought. John's father called her and told her that John's plane had disappeared from radar somewhere in the mountainous areas north of Mount Rainier. She knew that John's parents were aware of the problems between her and John, knew about his brother's involvement, but his father had never given her the impression that he felt any judgment towards her and had never shown any signs of reproach. However, she knew that they were very disappointed in her and David. He was the eldest, which means he had to be responsible and support his younger brother. Although everyone always knew that John was the more mature of the two. She thought about it. Why did I let this happen? How could I be so stupid, so weak? And now John is missing. Guilt consumed her as she remembered the last words she had spoken to him. She called him a bastard. Joanne bowed her head on her clasped hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking as the sounds of loud, overwhelming sobs dissolved into the ocean breeze. BRRRRR, 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 BRRRRR. She felt the phone vibrate in the pocket of her woolen coat. With a sigh, she pulled out the annoying little device and answered the call. Hello? Joanne? Where are you? Are you okay? The voice of Joanne's mother, Anne Jardine, sounded alarmed. I'm fine, Mom. Really? Everything's fine? I just needed to be alone. Are the girls okay? Yes, the girls are holding on as best they can, but they need their mother. Joanne, you need to be with them. Have you heard anything? Joanne closed her eyes and suppressed a sob. No, nothing yet. Frank promised to call as soon as there was news. Oh, okay, honey. Please come home. For the sake of the girls. Joanne looked at the dark, rushing waters and said, I'll be home in a while. Tell the girls I won't be around for long. Joanne, I'm so sorry about John, but I just know he'll be okay. Believe in him. Mom, it's not that I believe in him. I will always believe in John. I only hope that I will be allowed to restore his faith, his trust in me. All I can do now is pray and hope that he will come back to me. I pray to God that he will bring him back to us so that I can show him what he means to me and to the girls. Joanne couldn't contain her emotions and burst into tears before passing out. It took almost 20 minutes before she was able to calm down enough to get up and walk back to the car. Frank LaRoche was at Tacoma Narrows Airfield, waiting for updates from the numerous rescue helicopters searching for his son. Standing in front of the tower, he threw away the third cigar butt and crushed it with the toe of his shoe. Looking up at the dark clouds, he frowned. A storm was coming, and judging by the look of these clouds, it was a big one. In the distance, he heard the familiar sound of rotating blades and saw the orange and white colors of two US Coast Guard helicopters returning to base. Pursing his lips, he closed his eyes for a moment. He already knew that their search for John had yielded no results. Only two helicopters remained, continuing the search for his son's plane, the Comanche. His gaze was fixed on a distant mountain range, and deep wrinkles of excitement appeared on his forehead. What happened, John? He whispered to himself. His friends at the Federal Aviation Administration told him that the last transmission from John was a distress signal and that one of his engines had failed. But his son was too good a pilot to let one engine lead him astray. Something else had to happen. But where the hell is he? Frank. Frank turned around and saw Jake Holson approaching. Judging by the look on Holden's face, Frank knew it wouldn't be good news. Jake Holson coordinated the aerial search. Frank, you probably noticed that the weather is getting worse. We're going to pause the search until the storm passes. Sorry. How long will you continue searching, Jake? Frank asked. Jake looked away for a second and then looked Frank in the eyes again. I'm already calling off the search, Frank. I don't want my guys to be there when the storm hits. I'm very sorry, but I have to do this. Frank took out another cigar, cut off the tip, and lit it before answering. Yes, I know you're sorry, but there's John out there. Damn, you're like a second father to him. Jake frowned and growled. You think I don't know this? That I don't think about John? Do you really believe that I want to cancel the search? Frank took a drag from his cigar and held his breath for a moment before exhaling, the bluish smoke instantly dissipating into the wind. He felt the first drops of rain and looked at Jake again. Damn, I know you don't want to stop searching. Sorry, I'm just upset. I would do the same if I were you. He turned away and stared at the mountain range where the rain was getting heavier. Jake touched his old friend's shoulder, squeezed it, and then returned to the tower. Frank stood still for some time when the rain was already falling in dense streams. He thought about Joe, his daughter-in-law. He knew that she was suffering, afraid of losing John. When he first found out what David and Joe had done, he was furious. At David, Frank knew David and knew how he treated women. Frank remembered Bree, David's ex-girlfriend and fiancée. When David was studying at a submarine school on the East Coast, Bree decided to have fun with her friends and, oddly enough, met a guy in one of the student bars. Apparently, one of David's old friends was also in that bar and witnessed Bree being very open with this guy. When David returned, he heard rumors about Bree's behavior. When he confronted her, she brushed him off, calling him an idiot for believing false rumors. 2 weeks later, David followed her again when she went out with friends and discovered her secret affair with another man. Without saying a word, David walked over to where they were sitting at the table, and before Bree could recover, he took her left hand and removed her wedding ring. David didn't say a word to her or to him. By the time Bree broke away from the table and ran after David, he was already gone. Frank recalled how many times Bree called the house trying to contact his son, but David had already cut her out of his life. Moreover, David crossed out all the women. All that was left was to wait until the morning. Frank recalled with bitterness how David had changed. For him, all women become easy prey, whether married or single. Take it and throw it away, that's what his credo became. Several times Frank tried to talk to his son, but could not break through the wall he had built. And now David has reached Joanne. Why he did this, Frank could never understand. Shaking his head sadly, he sighed, amazed by it all. In the pouring rain, he continued to look into the distance at the mountains. David left, and now John is missing. Uh, what? What happened? I opened my eyes and found that it was dark around. For a moment I panicked and thought I was going blind, but gradually I began to see shapes and shadows in the darkness. There was a tight feeling coming from my belt as I tried to shake the fog out of my head. When I came to my senses, I remembered what happened. I crashed. Damn, I fell. The last thing I remembered was the treetops crashing against the fuselage. Where the hell am I? With effort, I closed my eyes and tried to take a deep breath, but a sharp pain pierced the left side of my chest. A broken rib or two? More likely. I'll need to bandage my chest when I what? Damn, I need to get off the plane. I panicked again at the thought of a fire. I was sure that the plane was about to catch fire and I would soon have a barbecue. I sniffed. No smoke yet. I didn't even smell a fuel leak, just the smell of pine and fir. The fuselage was tilted 30 degrees to the left, which explained the pressure on my stomach. I was still wearing my seat belt. I pulled the quick release mechanism and collapsed against the bulkhead, screaming. The Comanche suddenly lurched forward, sliding down. When the plane stopped abruptly, I fell onto the dashboard, hitting my forehead on the steering wheel. My head was exploding, as if there was a small gremlin inside me with a sledgehammer, relentlessly pounding on my skull. And I groaned, rubbing my temples until the pain went away. After a minute, I decided it was time to deal with my situation. First of all, where the hell am I? Grabbing the seat, I pulled myself to the side window and looked out, but could not see anything in the darkness. Reaching behind the seat, I found a flashlight and looked outside again. Damn me. I'm stuck in the damn trees, maybe 40-something feet above the ground. The fuselage was stuck between 3 Douglas fir trees. The wings and engines had long since been torn off. It was a miracle that the fuel did not ignite. Now it will take another miracle to get out of here. Looking back, I froze in shock. I looked into emptiness. The tail part was torn off just behind the rear seats, creating a new problem, as if I didn't have enough others. The ELT, the emergency beacon, is most likely somewhere far away and may not be working. Why am I still alive? I thought. I remained lying on the floor, my breathing causing pain to shoot through the left side of my chest every time. Crap. If I had a broken rib, I risked puncturing my lung. Feeling for a bag nearby, I discovered that it was stuck behind the co-pilot's seat and pulled it forward. Opening the bag, I rummaged through my clothes until I found what I needed. A thick t-shirt that I always take with me on trips. Having torn it into strips, I tightly wrapped the cloth around my chest, crossing the strips and tying them. Um, yes, it became a little easier. I realized that somehow I had to come down from this height before the law of attraction decided to work. After searching the bag again, I found some old sweatpants and threw them over my shoulders. I tried to push the door, but it was tightly pressed against the tree trunk. Moving between the front seats, I looked into the open part of the fuselage. A huge branch got stuck, piercing right through the body. Climbing over the center console, I was able to make my way to the floor behind the rear seats. I closed the bag and threw it into the opening where the cargo compartment used to be. I listened as the bag made its way through the branches, and finally I heard a dull thud on the ground. Well, it didn't take that long. Perhaps I'm not as high as I thought, flashed through my head. I slowly climbed over the rear seats and settled on the section of the fuselage behind them. I could hear the torn aluminum frame creaking and cracking beneath me, shifting a little with every movement I made. Everything was aggravated by the fact that I heard the familiar sound of drops on the building and the echoes of thunder in the distance. Great, the storm is coming, just like the icing on the cake. When I reached the branch, I noticed that it was strong enough to support my weight. I pulled my baseball cap further down, zipped up my leather jacket, and thought, it's now or never. Shining a flashlight on the branch, I carefully moved my legs onto it, clasping the branch with one hand. Carefully stepping over the piece of torn metal, I tried not to touch the sharp aluminum. Finally, I sat completely on the branch and was able to slide closer to the massive tree trunk. At this time, the rain intensified. Using sweatpants, I wrapped one of the legs around the shaft while holding the other one. Once finished, I tied the pant legs together, securing myself to the tree. As soon as I did this, a piercing grinding sound of metal reached my ears. The fuselage, filled with water due to the heavy rain, began to slide on the wet branches, and the weight pulled it down. The branch I was sitting on began to bend, the wood cracking under the strain. Fearing that the thick branch might break, I pressed myself as close to the tree trunk as possible, pulling my pants tighter around me. GRR Irish. Whoosh, the fuselage jumped out of place and disappeared into the dense forest, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches and twigs, and my branch jumped back into place. A second later, I heard a thud that was the last sound made by my dear Comanche as it crashed into the ground. Rest in peace, I whispered, peering into the darkness. Trembling, I took from my jacket pocket a small package from my emergency kit. Unfolding the shiny silver foil, I covered myself, trying to protect myself from bad weather. I soon felt the warmth gradually return, hiding under a light emergency blanket and hugging it tightly to protect myself from the wind and rain. I needed to stay on this tree until the morning, until the first rays of light. Attempting to descend in the dark would be too dangerous. I pulled the legs of my sweatpants up one more time to secure it in case I fell asleep. The branch was wide enough for me to curl up on it. I tucked my legs under, folded my hands in my lap, and hugged myself. Joanne sat at the dining table, looking out the window at the backyard, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand. For now, at her request, the girls stayed with her mother. John, she sighed quietly. She raised the glass to her lips, but did not drink. It seemed that the tears had already dried up, but her eyes moistened again, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Lord, what have I done? Why did I hurt the only man I've ever loved? Joanne thought back to the last months. John was so busy, constantly leaving town for days at a time. When she tried to talk to him, to ask him to spend time with her and the girls, he would look at her and say, "Joe, I would love to, but I need to fix the system. I promise, 2 more weeks and everything will be over." It was always 2 weeks, she thought. He never seemed to have time for her, or for Jody and Samantha. Moreover, for several months now he had not held her in his arms, had not touched her tenderly, had not loved her. She felt lonely, but that could not justify her betrayal with David. She remembered the week before John found her with his older brother. Then David stopped by their house. John flew to San Francisco for 2 days, something about a software glitch. When she opened the door, David stood in front of her in his Navy dress uniform, looking very impressive. "Hello, Joe. I decided to pop in and see how you are. David, it's great to see you, but John isn't here right now. He's in San Francisco for a couple of days. I just made some coffee. Would you like some? With pleasure, he answered and entered the house. She remembered his smile when he came in and followed her into the kitchen. Joanne remembered how handsome he was, 6'3", blonde curly hair, bright blue eyes, and that smile. That smile. She had always been attracted to David from the moment John introduced them. She even remembered how her future husband laughed, warning about his older brother. He had a reputation as a ladies' man, a veritable ladies' man in the uniform of a naval officer. Be careful, Joe. Several of my girlfriends have already gone to that wolf, John said with a smile, patting David on the back. Yes, she was always attracted to John's brother, but she never showed how much of an influence he had on her. She loved John so much, but there was something dangerous and attractive about David. She hated this feeling. She remembered them sitting on the swing in the yard, drinking coffee and talking about John. John is the happiest person I know. I envy him, David said, looking at the blue sky. David, you have nothing to envy, I replied. You're attractive, in great shape, and look damn sexy in uniform. Any woman would want to grab onto you. Again, that same smile, sparkling snow-white teeth. No, Joe, he has something that I've always wanted, something I've wanted for a long time. David, Joanne, I've wanted you for a long time, David said, taking my hands and gently pulling me towards him. I smelled his masculinity. No, David, I can't. I tried to push away, but he was too strong. Or maybe I was too weak. David, think about your brother. What? What about John? I don't need John, I need you, he whispered. God forgive me, but I felt my knees go weak as I kissed him back. My defenses collapsed, his onslaught won. I was his. When we finished having sex, it seemed to hit me the realization of what I had done was deafening. I had become an unfaithful wife, an adulteress, a simple dirty woman of easy virtue. I rushed to the bathroom, locked the door, and, leaning over the toilet, vomited. Only when there was nothing left in my stomach did I weaken and burst into tears. I lay on the cold tiles, head buried in the toilet, and sobbed, my thoughts filled with cheating on John. Outside, I heard a discreet knock on the bathroom door. Joanne, are you okay? I heard his voice seem to be filled with concern, but somehow I knew that he was not worried about me, but about what I was going to do next. I need to be alone, David. Just give me some time, I replied, wiping my tears. Maybe I should leave. Are you sure everything will be okay? Yes, David, I'm fine, I answered sharply. Just leave me alone, please. Okay? Call me later, okay? Yes, I'll call. I heard him return to the bedroom, get dressed and leave, leaving me devastated by his actions, or rather, by the fact that I could not prevent them. I never called David. I braced myself to meet John the next day. I remember how he smiled as he entered the house with bags and equipment. I was standing at the end of the hallway when he entered. He looked at me, smiled, dropped everything he was holding, and ran up to me, hugging me and kissing me hard on the lips. God, how I missed you, Joe, he whispered in my ear, hugging me tightly. I was terribly afraid that he would see my guilt written on my face and in my eyes, but he did not notice anything. John was so happy to be home that he wouldn't have even noticed the snake if it had bitten him. That night, I almost attacked him in bed. I didn't care that he was tired from the road. I'm rarely so persistent in bed, but that night, I was determined to make amends for my relationship with his brother. Johnny enjoyed every minute of my passion, but then he asked, "What got into you?" I answered quietly, "Oh, I just missed you a lot and wanted to show it." I remember now how he stared at me for a moment before hugging me tightly until we both fell asleep. I was still conscious when I heard his breathing become measured and calm. He never knew about the tears that flowed down my cheeks as I lay pressed against his back. The next morning, I heard the phone ring and panicked when John answered. "Hi, Dave. How are you? Where have you gone?" "You haven't come in for a long time," he said. I only heard his side of the conversation and was worried that David might accidentally say something about what happened between us while John was away. 10 minutes later, John hung up and went into the kitchen to pour himself a cup of coffee. When I entered the kitchen, my husband was sitting at the table with a mug of coffee and reading the newspaper. Looking up, he asked, "Good morning, honey. Did you sleep well?" There were no signs in his behavior that anything was wrong, and I felt relieved. Later, after John left for work, David called and asked how I was doing. I replied that everything was fine, but did not say anything about what happened. But he spoke first. "Joe, I just want to say that you were wonderful. I didn't hope for anything more." "David, please don't talk about this anymore. I made a terrible mistake. I was weak and should never have done this. I love John and don't want to lose him. Please forget about what happened." There was a long pause until David finally said, "Joanne, I can't forget what we had. I need you. I want to be with you again. Darling, stop it. Never say that again. Yes, I admit that I liked it, but I'm not going to put our marriage at risk any further. Please understand this, I beg you." After a long silence, I hung up and prayed that David would respect my request. Days turned into weeks. David no longer called or showed up at our house. John and I started making love again, and each time my passion got out of control. Each time my feeling of guilt became stronger, and I tried to atone for it, trying with all my might to please my husband, my only love. However, now I began to have moments when I was alone, I thought about David. I felt like I was going crazy. By this point, John was already beginning to realize that something was wrong. Several times he asked me if anything was bothering me. I could only answer that no, everything is fine. However, deep down I knew that everything was completely wrong and that I continued to betray him even in thoughts of his brother. Soon John was once again engrossed in work, and our recent closeness began to fade again. 2 months passed when John discovered my relationship with his brother. John was supposed to be away on a business trip for the weekend when David called me, sobbing into the phone. "Joanne, I can't take it anymore. The line was cut off. My God, I thought. David sounded so depressed that I was afraid he was going to do something rash. It seemed to me that he was going to hurt himself. How naive I was. I hurried to his apartment and found that the front door was slightly open. When I went inside, I found him in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, sobbing inconsolably. Like a lamb to the slaughter, I walked up to him and hugged his shoulders, which were shaking with sobs. "David, please look at me. What happened? What's wrong?" I begged. How stupid I was. Through tears, he sobbed. "I can't handle all this anymore. All this responsibility, long periods at sea. My life is empty. I have nothing to live for. And now I've hurt you and John. Joe, I love you both so much, and I'm afraid I've ruined your love for me." I held him in my arms until I stood up, took his hands, and pulled him with me. "Come with me," I said, taking him by the hand and leading him into the living room, sitting him on the sofa. "Wait here while I make us some coffee." When I tried to move away, he stood up and held me back, whispering, "Joanne, please don't go." I closed my eyes and let him hug me tightly, not realizing that he no longer seemed depressed. We had sex, and suddenly the phone rang and I screamed. David looked at the phone and said, "This is John." I gasped and looked down. The caller ID showed John Larouche. It was his mobile phone. "Oh God," I whispered, and as David reached to answer the phone, I grabbed my clothes and ran out of the room. When I returned, already dressed, David, still standing there, hung up and said John was on his way here. He said John had returned earlier and couldn't find me. Deciding that I was with Moira, his best friend, he went to David to go have a couple of glasses with him and play billiards. David tried to touch me, but I pulled away and headed towards the door. Already on the threshold, I turned to him and said, I don't know, David. I love John and don't want to lose him. Please don't do this. If he finds out, he will be hurt." I had no idea that John was hiding behind the bushes, eavesdropping on my words. Finally, I left. I needed to call Moira and somehow come up with an alibi, plunging deeper and deeper into lies and deceit. An hour later, my world collapsed. David called my cell phone and told me what happened between him and John. John knows everything. He saw us naked through the kitchen window. Gasping, I whispered, "No, please, not this," and passed out, heading straight home, trying to find a way to save my marriage before my husband returned. I waited for what seemed like an eternity for John to arrive. I heard a car pull up, but I heard two doors open and close. A minute later, there was a knock on the door, and afraid, I opened the door. David stood there in his arms as John, unconscious. David pulled his brother inside and laid him down on the couch. John's right cheek was bruised. "I had to hit him," David said. He was going to leave the bar, but in the state he was in, he would never have made it home. When I tried to take the keys from him, he hit me and I had to knock him out. It was the only way. Sorry, Joe. I just looked at him with anger. "And I'm sorry. You seduced me, but I went for it. You shouldn't have done this, and I shouldn't have allowed it. But it happened, and now I have to live with the consequences. Now I have to try to save my marriage, restore my relationship with my husband, the only man I have ever loved and will ever love." Joan. "Go away, David, just go away." I sat down opposite my husband, preparing to tell him everything when he woke up. But I didn't have a chance. John woke up, and when I tried to apologize, he said, "Joan, please, I don't want to hear anything. Don't say a word, don't look at me." When I tried to talk again, he shouted, "Shut up. I said don't say a word. Don't even dare say that you love me. I no longer have a loving wife, and I no longer have a brother." After that, I burst into tears and ran into the bedroom. He didn't talk to me for weeks. I was waiting for at least some sign of what would happen next. Is he going to file for divorce? Will he demand that I leave, or will he leave on his own, leaving me with the girls? A month later, he finally spoke and said he was leaving for a few days. He was flying to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, for a meeting with investors. Looking into his eyes, I asked if he had to leave, if he could stay so we could discuss everything. He looked at me coldly and asked if I liked living in this house, driving a Lexus and sending my girls to private school. Then he turned and left. I stood there watching him throw bags into the back of his pickup truck. I watched as he got into the car, backed up and drove out of the yard, never once looking in my direction. Tears welled up in my eyes as I closed the door. Now he has disappeared. His plane crashed somewhere in this damn wilderness. I lost him, and I will never be able to undo what I did. I will never be able to show him how much I love him again. Screaming, I threw the glass at the wall. The empty glass shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces, several pieces of glass embedded in the wall. I began to sob, drowning in my despair. I opened my eyes and for a moment forgot where I was. Wrapped in a silver blanket, I noticed the morning light breaking through the edge of the canvas. Throwing off the blanket, I cried out in surprise when I realized that I was tied to a tree 40 or 50 feet in the air. "Damn it," I swore. "How?" And then it dawned on me. The plane crashed. In the morning light, through the pouring rain, I looked down and could see what had once been my beloved Comanche aircraft. Now all I saw was the twisted hulk of a blue and white aluminum fuselage. The plane descended from the altitude and stood on its nose, leaning against a row of Douglas fir trees. I looked up at the sky, squinting against the rain. In the distance, short flashes of lightning pierced the heavy clouds, and almost immediately behind them came peals of thunder. Okay, I better get out of here, I thought. An hour later, I stood next to my old Comanche and looked at the wreckage. What the hell could cause the engines to stall? I remembered checking the plane before the flight and not noticing anything suspicious. I inspected the engines, checking for leaks or loose connections, but everything seemed fine. I remember that in the parking lot the engines showed the correct speed. Well, there's nothing you can do about it now. The National Transportation Safety Board will investigate, so we'll have to wait for their findings. For now, I need to find a way out of these mountains and shelter. Barely breathing, I walked for several miles and came across a small cave, partially hidden among large boulders. I understood that there might be animals inside, and I carefully went inside. There was enough light coming through the entrance to look around the small room and make sure it was empty. Breathing a sigh of relief, I threw my bag on the ground and took off my leather jacket and sweater. I took another wool sweater out of my bag and put it on. Oh yes, that's better, I thought, although I'll have to leave my pants on. After searching the cave, I found enough old branches and brushwood to start a small fire. Taking out my battered old Zippo lighter, I sat down at the entrance and soon successfully lit a fire. Watching the smoke escape through a natural opening in the ceiling gave me a sense of satisfaction. I took off my wet jeans and laid them out on the rocks next to the fire to dry. Sitting next to the flames, I warmed myself and listened to the rain drumming outside. I decided to take inventory of my belongings. Joe would laugh now, saying what an Eagle Scout I am, always ready for any surprises. In the bag, I found 2 pairs of dry socks, a t-shirt, a long-sleeve cotton shirt, some energy bars, a small first aid kit, and a liter plastic water bottle. In a secret pocket, I found my Bowie knife and a Colt .45 pistol. I have never flown without this weapon. The pistol has been in our family for 2 generations. He served my father during the Vietnam War, and when my father gave me that plane, he also gave me the gun. This was unexpected, because I always thought that David would get the Colt, but my father thought otherwise and never explained why. Trotting through my things, I found 2 more full pistol magazines. Okay, I thought, they might come in handy. I placed the magazines next to the pistol and knife. Finally, I pulled out my 3 favorite Carlos Torano 1916 Cameroon cigars from their old brown leather case. Thank the gods they were dry. Shivering, I wrapped myself in a thermal blanket and sat by the fire, listening to the rain outside. My stomach was growling, but I knew I would have to wait until morning to eat one of the bars. You will have to save food temporarily. The warmth of the fire began to drive away the biting cold, and leaning against the wall of the cave, I watched the flames dance along its inner walls. My thoughts began to wander, and an image of Joanna appeared before my eyes. I saw her smiling and laughing with the girls as they sat at the kitchen table working on some school project. I couldn't help but smile, remembering how they all looked so happy, Joe laughing and the girls giggling. But then my eyes closed, and I could hardly suppress a groan as the following image appeared before me. My dear brother hugging Joe. I remembered how Joe left and David remained on the floor. I suddenly roared and punched the wall. The pain echoed in my right hand. Damn, that was fucking stupid, idiot, I muttered and sat back down. I pulled out a small first aid kit from my backpack and treated my wounds, glad that I didn't break my arm. Why? Why did she go to him? I screamed. What did I do to push her away so that she would go into his vile arms? My side wound hurt more and more, and I pulled up the torn t-shirt that I tied around my torso. That's better, I thought. I stared at the fire, and the swaying flames gradually lulled me, plunging me into much-needed sleep. Joanna was still sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window and watching the pouring rain and storm clouds, when the front door opened and a small, gentle voice called out with excitement, "Mom, Mom, where are you?" Joanna turned around to see her youngest daughter, Samantha, running into the kitchen and wrapping her strong, muscular arms around her. Another pair of hands joined them, and Joanna looked up to meet Jody's hazy green eyes. "Mom, don't worry. Dad will be fine. I just know it." Joanna smiled at both daughters and gently ran her hand over their cheeks. I know. Your father is known for his tenacity, but he's there alone now, lost in this forest and in such a terrible storm." She turned away and tears ran down her cheeks. Turning around, she hugged her daughters again. She looked at Jody and was amazed at how much like her father she looked. Both shared a passion for flying, and Jody, talented in technology and computer science, was already developing complex software. Sometimes she surpassed her father in understanding and solving the most difficult problems. John, never envious, was proud of her skill and achievements. Samantha was more like her mother, very feminine and athletic. As an accomplished gymnast, she excelled on the uneven bars. Her father never missed her competitions. The day John disappeared, she came home with good news. She was selected to compete in the 2008 Pacific Gymnastics Championships. Having learned that her father's plane crashed, Samantha immediately forgot about gymnastics and spent all her time with her mother. Now the three stood in the kitchen, hugging each other, and hoped that their father and husband would soon be found alive. After the girls had dinner, they went to their grandparents to see if they needed help. Joanna stayed home and sat on the sofa, staring at the incessant storm outside the window. The news said the storm could quickly develop into a typhoon. She knew she needed to start sealing the windows and strengthening the house, but right now she didn't care. Gradually, an irritating sound entered her consciousness. Telephone. Was it news? She quickly grabbed the phone and said, "Yes." "Joe. Joanna?" She recoiled at the sound of her brother-in-law's voice. What right did he have to call her now? She thought in rage. "Why are you calling, David? I have nothing to tell you." "Joanna, I'm so sorry about everything. I learned about John when we came to repair Subic Bay in the Philippines. I was able to go on emergency leave. I'm in Seattle now. Is there anything I can do for you or the girls?" "Yes, stay away from me and my daughters. You've already done enough. I know it's not just your fault, but you knew what you were doing from the very beginning. Why were you able to seduce me so easily? I still go to a psychologist because of this. But now I can tell you one thing. I no longer have any feelings for you. John disowned you, and so did I. Just leave me alone." With these words, Joanna hung up. "God, not now. Not when John is there," she whispered through her tears. "David, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at sea?" Frank looked in surprise at his son, standing in the hallway and thoroughly wet due to the downpour. "We were at the port, and I got a message about John. Is it true that they stopped searching?" "Temporarily, while the storm is at its peak. Jake should have called off the search too dangerous." "Dad, where was the last point of contact with John?" David looked into his father's eyes and saw excruciating pain in them. "How I wish he felt the same way about me," David thought. David followed his father into the kitchen, where a topographic map of Mount Rainier and the surrounding area lay on the table. "We think it fell somewhere around here." Frank pointed to an area roughly halfway between Mount Rainier and I-90. "We know it flew past Snoqualmie Pass, but we don't know how far it went. For some reason, his emergency beacon is not emitting a signal." David looked intently at the map, studying the terrain. "Did he fly to the Narrows?" "Yes, he was returning home just before the storm began. Now they say the storm may be reclassified to a typhoon." David didn't say anything else. He looked his father in the eyes again, then turned around and headed for the exit. Frank called out to him, but his son did not stop. Frank looked at the closing door and grinned. He understood where his eldest son was heading. A dim gray light made its way to the entrance of the cave, the sound of the rain creating something like a waterfall at the entrance. I opened my eyes and found that the fire had gone out. Well, at least my pants are dry, I thought. Throwing off the thermal blanket, I stood up and put on my jeans. I put on dry socks and boots. It felt much better. I might be hungry, but at least I was dry somewhat. Even the pain in my side subsided a little. My right arm was still aching and stiff. I looked at my swollen knuckles. This will teach me to control myself, I thought, and I clenched and unclenched my fingers several times, trying to relieve the tension. Staggering, I walked out to the entrance and saw that the storm had intensified. "Damn it," I muttered. "This is bad." The rain poured down like buckets, but fortunately, the water did not flow along the wall of the cave. Watching the fury of the rain, I realized that the wind speed was approaching storm speed, if not stronger. The problem was that the cave was located at the base of a gorge, a narrow one, gradually filling with water. According to my calculations, perhaps by midnight the water will already reach the entrance. Too bad it wasn't cold enough for snow. I peered into the distance and could barely make out the base of Mount Rainier through the pouring rain. its peak was hidden in dark clouds. Realizing that I would have to leave the shelter before the water blocked the exit, I returned to the dying fire and put on a leather jacket, throwing most of my things into a bag. I put the gun in the holster and hooked it into my jeans and fastened the knife to my belt. He put 2 magazines in the inner pocket of his jacket and, with the bag in his hands, went out to the entrance to the cave. All that's left to do is wait. I hoped that the rain would subside a little so that I could set out safely. After a couple of hours, the rain actually subsided, but the wind remained just as strong. Now or never, I thought and stepped forward. I walked along the cave, trying to avoid the waterfall, and headed west along the mountainside against the wind. Looking into the gorge, I realized that I did the right thing by leaving. The water level was rising much faster than I expected. I looked ahead, into the wind, hoping to see at least some sign of aircraft, but knew that this was unlikely. No one will fly in such conditions. I needed to somehow get to the west side and get down from this mountain. After walking for what seemed like half a day, but in fact barely an hour, I passed the gorge and saw a long empty stretch of land. Resembling a huge scar, as if from the blow of Godzilla's tail, old Japanese, not modern American, the ground was completely devoid of vegetation. This torn section was right in my path. I would have to climb about 7,100 feet to get around from above. If I tried to cross it, I would get stuck in the mud. The rain turned the soil into streams of mud. I decided to go around the destroyed area and, moving with difficulty, began to climb up. 20 minutes later, out of breath, I realized I had another 50 feet to climb. I can do this, I thought, although my strength was already beginning to fade. Thank God I ate one of the energy bars and had 2 more left. By this time, the rain had intensified, lashing my face along with the wind. I had to keep my head down to breathe. Finally, I managed to climb over the top of the scar and begin my descent. I guessed it was probably about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was already soaked to the skin and shivering from the cold. Thank God for my leather jacket. Even though it was wet, it still kept me warm. By the end of the day, I was already at the foot of the mountain and realized that I needed to seek shelter again. Smiling, I remembered the cave. Damn, the water level is probably already at the entrance, I thought. Moving west, I finally reached the bottom. I took cover under 3 large spruce trees to get out of the wind and rain and took out another energy bar. God, I'm so hungry. The bar disappeared within seconds, after which I took a sip from my water bottle. Grist! A huge bolt of lightning flashed directly overhead, striking a tree not 50 feet from me, followed by a powerful clap of thunder. Damn, I thought, this is really bad. I need to keep moving. The forest plunged into darkness as the day gave way to a stormy night. I found myself in trouble. Darkness is about to come, and I will remain here in the open air without reliable shelter. I forced myself to get up and move on. Soon, immersed in darkness, I wandered through these stormy expanses, drenched in rain. Taking out my flashlight, I could barely see anything further than 6 to 10 feet ahead through this downpour. I approached a small rise and, gathering my last strength, climbed to the top. Having reached the top, I tried to look around, but saw nothing. I turned to move away from the wind, and at that moment my foot slipped in the mud. Trying to hold on, I felt the slope begin to collapse, and I flew down along with it until I hit some solid object. Gasping from pain, I pressed my hand to my left side, trying to relieve the sharp pain. With difficulty, breathing heavily, I sat down, leaning my back against what I had hit. The flashlight and bag were gone, but I noticed a small light about 20 yards ahead. Having collected myself, I tried to stand, leaning my hands on what had stopped my fall, and felt the rough, stacked wood. Running my hand along the wood, I realized that I had crashed into a wall of logs, some kind of building, maybe an old house. I moved towards the light, noticing a flashlight nearby. When I returned, I saw that it was a really old house, very old. I walked around it and found the entrance where the door was missing. Shining a flashlight inside, I saw debris and pieces of old furniture. Rain poured down on the south side, coming through several holes in the roof, but the north side was dry and had an old iron stove. Thank you, Lord, I whispered and returned to the place where I fell. I needed my bag. I found her about 20 feet up the hill. 15 minutes later, I started a small fire in the iron stove using broken pieces of furniture. The heat from the stove illuminated the room slightly, and I was able to examine the old shack. I found several antique saws and axes and assumed that this hut had once served loggers. In the corner, on the damp side, stood an old bed with a dirty mattress stuffed with straw. I dragged her closer to the stove and fell on this crumbling mattress, right in my wet clothes. I was relieved to feel safe under a roof again. It was probably about 9, maybe 10 o'clock now. Sitting down, I noticed a shelf next to the door. On the shelf, there was a brass candlestick with another intact candle. I also noticed animal tracks imprinted in the thick layer of dust on the floor. I found the door leaning against a support and secured it by propping it up with pieces of furniture. Well, at least this will keep the big animals away, I muttered. I returned to the bed, took off my jacket, boots, and jeans, hung them on the headboard next to the stove, and wrapped myself in a thermal blanket. Lying down, I soon dozed off. This is the closest we can get, Davy. Too much turbulence near the mountains. Get ready, and we'll winch you down, okay? I still can't figure out how you talked Jimmy into doing this. You must have some dirt on him. Lieutenant Blairfield, the co-pilot of the Navy helicopter, looked at David, who was standing by the open hatch of the black helicopter. David was fully equipped to survive the elements with a backpack and satellite phone. He turned and said, "Okay, let's get started then." The helicopter was shaken by powerful gusts of wind, but Captain Jimmy Lee, David's pilot and longtime friend, maintained control. Jimmy turned and looked at him. "Good luck, buddy. I hope you find your brother." David waved his hand and fastened himself to the winch. After the flight mechanic checked his harness, he gave David a thumbs up. "Ready to go." David went down, and the strong wind and rain immediately threw him towards the side of the helicopter. The winch began to slowly lower him into a small clearing among tall trees. A few minutes later, he unclipped his carabiner and fell the last 6 feet onto soft grass and dirt. Looking at the helicopter, he gave a thumbs up, and the Black Hawk turned and disappeared into the storm. The howling wind rained down on his figure, and David was forced to turn his back to the wind to get his bearings. He remembered from his father's map that there was an old hut about 2 miles from here. It is marked on the map as a Forest Service office, although it was rarely used for its intended purpose. If he can get to the hut, he can use it as a base to find his brother. "I wonder what John will do if I find him," he thought. Well, we'll have to wait and find out. Using a compass to determine direction, David headed northwest, hoping to find an old cabin. The daylight had almost faded as David, bent over, slowly made his way through the raging elements. With a powerful flashlight strapped to his shoulder, he continued on his way to the hut. Shake! Bang! Bang! David jumped out of the way as a huge cedar tree crashed to the ground not 10 feet away. "Johnny, you should fucking forgive me after this." The journey took longer than he expected. What should have taken a couple of hours turned into an endless night hike. After checking the compass, he was convinced that he was still on the right path, although he still did not know how much was left in the hut. I woke up to the howling of the storm, looked around, and for a moment forgot where I was. Seeing the soft orange light emanating from the iron stove, I quietly cursed. Damn, I thought it was all just a dream. Smiling, I got out from under the blanket and grabbed my clothes. Well, at least it was dry, I thought with a grin. I looked at the stream of rain pouring through the holes in the roof on the far side of the hut. Having collected several pieces of broken furniture, I threw them into the stove and rekindled the fire. Warming up by the stove, I listened to the fierce gusts of wind and thought, this must be a typhoon, judging by the sound of the wind. Lord, thank you for saving me from falling and bringing me here. My stomach was growling again, and I decided to eat half of the last energy bar. I then pulled out the cigar, cut off the tip, and carefully turned it clockwise over the flame of a Zippo lighter to light it. Sitting on the old wooden floor, I enjoyed my cigar and became lost in my thoughts. Images of Joanna and the girls appeared again before my eyes. They're probably scared right now. I wish there was a way to let them know I'm okay. Joanna must be suffering, and rightly so. Let him suffer. I closed my eyes and rubbed my forehead, thinking about her. Remembering the past, I realized that she had always been partial to my brother. After all, what woman hasn't fallen for his charms? I lost several girlfriends because of him, and now, my wife. I couldn't believe that she decided to cheat, and my brother decided to betray him. I was sure that they both loved me as much as I loved them, and I continue to love, no matter what. But if I really love them, then why haven't I tried to find out why and how this all happened? Maybe there is a greater feeling between them than what Joe and I had. I continued to rub my forehead, as if this could ease the pain that was tearing me apart from the inside. And then a thought came to my mind. Disappear, disappear, so that no one can see me again. Everyone will think that I died in a catastrophe, that the elements took my life. They won't find me. The forest here is so huge that they will never be able to find my remains. This way Joanna and David can be happy together. Of course, she will worry about my death, feel guilty for cheating, but time, in the end, heals any pain. The only problem is Samantha and Jody. I will never be able to talk to them or hug them again. Can I live with this? Will my love for my daughters outweigh my desire to free Joe and David for their happiness? My girls will grieve for me, but this grief will not last forever. After all, they don't know the truth about treason, and if they knew, how would they feel about their mother? I can't risk this. In addition, the insurance payment will provide them. In time, they will be able to accept their uncle as a father. I would miss my mother and father, but Joanna and I can no longer live the same way as before. I have to somehow get rid of this bitterness, anger, and pain. I must find the strength to forgive them. Despite the deafening roar of the storm, I suddenly heard a loud crunching sound near the hut. I tensed up, turned in the direction where the sound was coming from, and heard a distinct cracking sound, similar to, "Oh, damn!" The roof shattered into splinters, pieces of rotten wood and tiles flew in all directions. A huge tree trunk fell through the roof, sending the walls of the hut flying in all directions. Then everything plunged into darkness. Tall Douglas firs, pines, and cedars swayed and trembled under the pressure of the wind at the peak of the storm. Streams of rain flooded the dense forest. The sky was filled with black clouds that rushed rapidly over the hills and mountains surrounding Mount Rainier. Lightning flashed through these heavy clouds, leaving bright, bluish-white trails. Any forest creature with a survival instinct would have found shelter long ago, even before the storm hit the forest. Any, except for one person who made his way through the storm, trying to find an old forest hut. This is too damn bad, David thought as he tripped over a massive fallen tree trunk. The hut should be here, but it isn't. David took out his Magellan GPS and checked the spot where the old cabin was thought to be. The grove was illuminated by a flash of lightning, and he closed his eyes, holding the device. "Where is this damn hut?" he shouted into the void. After wiping the water off his glasses, he surveyed the area again. Nothing. Damn it, nothing. The next flash of lightning illuminated a fallen tree, and David caught a glimpse of the remains of a small structure. A huge trunk pierced the fragile structure, the very hut he was looking for. "Well, things are getting better and better," he muttered, heading towards the remains of the hut. David reached what had once been the western wall, now in pieces. The main part of the destruction occurred on the southern side, from where the southern and eastern walls were knocked out. The ceiling collapsed in the southern part, leaving only a small area intact on the northern side. "Well, I doubt another tree will fall. Maybe this hut will be enough to set up camp," he said to himself. Walking around the remaining part of the hut, he found a doorway where the door had been knocked out. The light of the lantern illuminated the interior, and he saw that the supporting beam of the ceiling had fallen at an angle, and part of the wall had been crushed by a tree trunk. In the corner, he noticed an old iron stove and froze. Next to her was a familiar bag, Johnny's bag. "Johnny John, where are you?" he shouted. He heard a faint sound from the other side of the hut and walked around the fallen beam. He illuminated the darkness with a flashlight and saw his brother pinned under the wall. "John," he shouted, carefully stepping over the rubble and the wall and kneeling down next to John. John turned his head towards the light and looked at David, not recognizing him because he was wearing a hood and glasses. I'm pinned under this wall and beam, but I don't think my legs are broken. If we somehow lift this beam, maybe I can get out," John said, turning his face away from the rain. David nodded and patted him on the shoulder. "I'll look for something to use as leverage. Be back soon." David searched the hut for something suitable, but couldn't find anything inside that was strong or long enough, so he went out to look outside. He soon returned, carrying a piece of broken wood, a thick branch from a fallen trunk. He dragged it to John and shoved it under the rubble of the wall. Now he needed leverage. Looking around, he noticed a stove. 15 minutes later, John sat leaning against the north wall under the remaining piece of roof. David dragged the stove over to him and tried to start a fire, but all the wood was wet. He knew John was wet and suffering from hypothermia. Quickly opening his backpack, he took out a small package. Having found a free place, he opened it, and a small two-person dome tent stood in front of him. He covered the tent with a tarp and dragged his brother inside. Once they were inside, he lit the portable gas stove and told John to undress. While his brother was taking off his clothes, David took woolen thermal underwear from his backpack. "Put this on," he said, handing John the clothes. Retrieving his sleeping bag, David unzipped it. By this point, John was already in his thermal underwear, and David told him to get into his sleeping bag. The wind and rain battered the tent as David heated water for soup on a small Peak 1 camp stove. He glanced at John, curled up in his sleeping bag. The bag could withstand temperatures down to -15 Fahrenheit, and David knew it would help keep his brother warm. Looking at him, David was not surprised to see that John had dozed off. He knew he would have to wake his brother. He will monitor John's condition for some time until he is sure that he is okay. While John slept, David left the tent and secured the tent and tarp to the ground. This shelter was durable and could withstand the elements. He grabbed John's bag and tossed it inside, next to his backpack. Then he returned to the tent and zipped up the entrance. John, wake up. You need to eat. John." David saw his brother's eyes open slightly, and he turned to him. "Yeah, David." "Hey, brother, how are you feeling?" "What the hell are you doing here? How did you find me? Why did you find me?" David was ready for such a reception. He knew that John had not forgiven him and most likely would not forgive him. But he didn't care. The main thing was that John was safe, and David was willing to endure his hatred. "I'm here because I'm your brother and I love you. I knew about this old forest cabin, but I didn't think that I would find you here. Although, knowing you, this is not surprising. Now shut up and eat." David thrust a metal mug of hot broth into his hands. "I know you hate me, and it's deserved, but for now you'll have to put up with my presence. So get used to it, okay?" "Fuck you," John snapped, looking angrily at his older brother, but still took the hot mug of soup. After drinking it, John saw David sit down next to him and ask about his legs. "Fine with your legs. Now stay away from me," John growled. David rolled his eyes and shook his head. This is going to be a long night, he thought. "Okay, John, I'll leave you alone, and I'm going to get some sleep myself." "I'll see you in the morning," David said, putting his backpack under his head and settling down to sleep. John sat silently looking at his brother. David turned away from him. After a while, John looked at his bag, lying next to his sleeping bag. He thought about the gun for a moment. Looking at David again, he discarded this thought, caused by his hatred. He lay down on his back, breathing heavily with anger. The cause of his family's destruction lay just a few steps away. Feeling the warmth of the broth and the comfort of his sleeping bag, he finally succumbed to fatigue and soon fell into a deep sleep. Joanna couldn't sleep. The storm continued to rage, wind and rain battering the house. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of hot tea in her hands, looking out the window, beyond which the elements were raging. The girls slept in their rooms, and Joanna's mother rested in hers. Joe and the girls insisted that she not be left alone during this terrible storm. As Joanna watched the elements torment the forest at night, she knew she was taking a risk by sitting so close to the large glass window. If it were John, the windows would already be boarded up, or at least sealed, and the curtains drawn. But John wasn't here. He was lost somewhere in the wilderness, in the thick of the storm, if he was alive. No, don't think about it, she thought furiously. He's alive, I know it. Joanna sighed and stood up. She looked at her watch and noticed that it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. It's better to try to get some sleep, she thought, and headed towards the stairs. At that moment, a deafening crash was heard, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a low howl. She turned around sharply and saw that the window was broken by some strange flat object. The entire kitchen was flooded with water, and glass shards were scattered across the floor and table. Joanna looked with wide eyes at the chair she had just sat on. It was almost broken in half, and a large piece of the window was stuck in the seat. The back rested on a thin part of the frame. "Mother, are you okay? What happened?" the girls shouted, running into the kitchen. Jody, "Sam, stay away from the kitchen and dining area. The floor is strewn with broken glass." "Joanna, what happened? Are you okay?" her mother asked, standing at the foot of the stairs and looking at the broken window. Yes, Mom, I'm fine, but stay upstairs with the girls. There's too much broken glass here. It looks like something broke through a window, maybe part of the roof or something like that." Joanna walked up to the stairs and the girls hugged her. "We'll leave this until the morning. Let's go upstairs. Jody, Sam, check your windows and make sure the curtains are drawn. I'll check the other rooms." The girls ran to their rooms, and Joe and her mother headed to the bedroom. Joe noticed that the blinds were closed and sighed with relief. She looked at her mother. "Joe, how long have we lived here? Do you think this is the first storm we've experienced?" Joanna smiled and nodded. "Yes, I know. I know." Her mother came up to her and hugged her. Joe couldn't hold back her tears. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder and began to sob. "Joe, he'll be fine. I believe in this man more than anyone. Unless God decides otherwise, he will crawl to you on his knees if necessary. And I feel that he is alive and doing everything possible to return to you and the girls. This person loves and adores you." Joanna made a face at these words. She understood that they were said to calm her down. But deep down, Joe carried a heavy burden of guilt. Will John even want to return to her? As if reading her thoughts, her mother said, "Joe, you have a lot of work ahead of you. I don't know why you did what you did to David, but if you love John as much as I think you do, you'll have to do everything to make him understand how much he means to you." Joanna pulled away and wiped her face, her mother still holding her hand. "I know, Mom, and I love John so much. He is my life. I don't know what I will do if I lose him. I don't know what to do to keep him. He hasn't spoken about what happened since that night. We've barely spoken for the past month. I don't know what to say, and he's avoiding me. I'm afraid that he will leave me, divorce me, and I wouldn't blame him. He found out that his wife cheated on him with his brother. I can't understand why he stayed with me for the last month." Joanna's mother looked at her carefully and saw a deep sadness and remorse on her face. "Joanna, have you thought about professional help, about the consultation?" her mother said, wiping the tears from her daughter's face and kissing her forehead. "Yes, I thought so. Actually, Mom, I've been seeing a psychologist for the last 2 weeks. But I'm afraid to ask John to come with me. The psychologist advises me to try to persuade him to come with me." "He'll agree, Joe. You have to ask him. You may not think so, but John loves you. I see it in his eyes, in the way he looks at you. It is this love for you that causes him such pain. He has lost trust in you. Ask him. Tell him you need his support." Joanna pulled away and sat on the edge of the bed. "Okay, Mom, I'll try." Suddenly, Jody and Sam ran into the room and sat on either side of their mother, hugging her. "Mom, will everything be okay with Dad?" Samantha asked, looking into her mother's eyes, and Joanna saw the sparkle of tears in the eyes of her youngest daughter. She hugged her and whispered, "Yes, he will be okay." Now all that was left was to convince myself of this. David woke up first. Something was different. Then it dawned on him. There was no wind, it was quiet. He stared at the tent's canopy and saw the morning light breaking through the thin material. He unzipped the entrance and looked outside. Morning came and a gray fog hung around. But the storm passed. He grabbed his backpack and took out his satellite phone. Once outside, he inspected the damage to the hut. "Oh my God," he whispered. The tree that crashed through the tiny hut was huge. How it hadn't completely collapsed, he didn't understand, but somehow the northeast corner remained intact. David knew for sure John was going to die when the tree fell. The entire southern part of the hut was destroyed. He stood next to the tent and spoke into a satellite phone. "BZZZ, BZZZ, BZZZ. Oh, my head!" Joanna moaned and pressed her hand to her temples, rubbing them. She finally realized that the sound was coming from her cell phone and reached for it. However, Jody was lying on the bed next to her. As she reached over her daughter, the call stopped. She picked up her phone and saw that she had one new message. After listening to it, she heard her father-in-law's voice asking her to call back. The next sentence made Joanna scream, waking Jody and Samantha. "They found him. Found your father. He's alive." "What? What?" Both girls jumped up and stared at their mother. "This is a message from your grandfather. They found your father. They found him and are now taking him to the airport. Get dressed. Jody, wake up Grandma." Joanna's joy spread to the girls, and they ran out of the room, screaming with joy. Pressing her hands to her face, Joanna closed her eyes and quietly prayed, "Thank you, Lord, for keeping him safe, for returning him to me and the girls." When her mother entered the room, she saw Joanna crying with relief. Joanna, noticing her, rushed to her mother and shouted, "He's alive and on his way to the airport. They're transporting him in a Navy helicopter right now." The next few minutes turned into chaos as Joanna, the girls, and her mother quickly got dressed and ran out to the car. As they drove out of the garage, they noticed the morning silence. The sun began to break through the clouds, painting the landscape in bright colors. Joanna stopped the car for a moment and pressed her head against the steering wheel. "Mother?" Joanna raised her head and wiped her eyes. "It's okay. I'm okay. Let's go to your father." While they were driving to Tacoma Narrows Airport, she called Frank. "Frank LaRouche is on the phone. Leave a message and I'll call you back." She smiled. Long story short, it was Frank. "Frank, this is Joe. I got your message and we're on our way to the Narrows. Jody, Sam, and my mom are with me. Call me back." A couple of minutes later, her phone rang. "Joe LaRouche, I'm listening." "Joe, you shouldn't go to the airport. John will be taken straight to the memorial. And, Joe, David will be with him." Joanna held her breath for a moment before saying, "Okay, then let's go to the memorial. We'll meet you there. How is he?" "I don't know, Joe. They lowered the basket for him on a rope. David went looking for John last night and somehow found him. But in order to pull them out, a helicopter was needed. See you soon." "Okay, Frank, we'll be there in 20 minutes. See you." Joanna zoned out and thought about Frank's words. David found John. David will most likely be in the hospital. Her joy at John's return began to gradually give way to anxiety, fear of what John must be feeling. David, the man who seduced her, the brother who betrayed him, saved John. She gritted her teeth and decided that, despite David, despite John, despite everything that had happened, she would be there for her husband. I remember how I came to my senses to the sounds of heavy rhythmic beats. Opening my eyes, I stared at the ceiling of the military green-gray dome, through which daylight filtered, creating a strange, almost radioactive glow. I tried to crawl to the exit, but cried out from the sharp pain in my ankle. Damn, maybe I broke it after all, I thought. This rhythmic hum intensified, and suddenly David looked into the tent. "Hey, sleepyhead, ready to go home." "What are you talking about?" I muttered. "Got a trip in store for you thanks to the US Navy. I hope you appreciate it, Grumpy." "What are you talking about? Did you bring a helicopter here?" David looked at me as if I was a little out of my mind. "Come on, Johnny. Don't pretend you don't understand. Yes, I asked for help, and now there is a Navy Seahawk helicopter hovering above us. So let's get out of this tent and jump into your hovering taxi." David squeezed into the tent and helped me crawl out. "Don't forget my bag. I didn't want to leave my father's gun." "I know. The Colt is in my backpack." I looked at him angrily. "On what right did you take it?" David looked at me seriously and said, "John, honestly, I didn't know how you would react, and I knew that you always take that 45 with you. I just didn't want to risk it in case you weren't yourself. I'm sorry if I was wrong, but I'll have to deal with it now." I muttered something and finally got out of the tent. Sure enough, a light blue Seahawk helicopter was hovering above us, and a lifeline and basket was lowered to the ground, about 25 yards away. David helped me up and, partially supporting me, walked me to the basket. After making sure I was secured, he returned to the tent and carried out my bag. When everything was ready, he gave a thumbs up, and they began to lift me towards the helicopter. Mixed feelings overwhelmed me. I was glad that this nightmare was over and I was returning home, but I was annoyed that it was David who found me and rescued me. My plan to disappear without a trace vanished. Soon David also came on board and we set off. I heard David yell to the pilot to head for Memorial Lutheran Hospital, and he nodded in response. David sat opposite me and stared at me the entire flight. I, not wanting to notice his concern, turned away. Damn it all, I thought. I'll have to see Joanna and David together soon. Not what I wanted. Half an hour later, the helicopter landed on the hospital's landing pad, where they were already waiting for us with a stretcher. I was quickly transferred to the emergency room and laid on a bed. A young doctor examined me while nurses and other staff connected me to the machines. I screamed as they examined my left leg. The pain in my ankle made everything burst into flames. I groaned as they checked everything else and cried out when the doctor pressed on the left side of my torso. "Mr. Lerouch, does it hurt?" There was concern in his eyes, and I nodded. "Okay, we'll send you for an X-ray. You may have a broken rib or two and possibly a broken left ankle. Besides the many abrasions and bruises, does it hurt anywhere else?" "No, I guess not," I said. "Just really tired." "After what you've been through, it's not surprising, Mr. Lerouch." "Please," I said, "call me John. Mr. Lerouch is my father." The young doctor smiled and said, "Okay, John. In addition, you are hypothermic. You know, it's a miracle that you're even here. I heard that your plane crashed and you spent several days in the wild during a storm." I just looked at him as he continued his inspection. I muttered under my breath, "I don't know if it's a miracle that I'm here." The doctor stopped and looked at me for a moment before continuing. I was soon taken for an X-ray and then transferred to a room in the intensive care unit. The same young doctor later came to me and announced all the news. "John, your left ankle was shattered. We'll have to reconstruct it, and you won't be able to lean on it for at least 6 weeks. The plaster will remain for at least 4 to 6 months. The orthoptist will arrive later today. You also have 2 fractured ribs, but they remain intact. I saw how you wrapped the chest, which probably helped. We treated all abrasions and bruises. You will be kept in intensive care until your body temperature returns to normal, but this should not take more than a day or two. Then we will transfer you to a separate room. We put you on enrollment 4 with a mild sedative so you can rest. Any questions?" "Doctor, what is your name?" "I don't even know your name." "Brian. Brian Sullivan, but you just forgot that I already introduced myself. John, please call me Brian." "Brian, thank you for everything you did. This is my job." He patted me on the shoulder and said, "Take care of yourself." I watched him and then closed my eyes. Soon I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, it was dark. Damn, I must have slept all day. Turning my head, I noticed someone sitting on a chair next to my bed. I couldn't figure out who it was in the darkness, but I heard a rustling sound. "John, are you awake?" I couldn't help but let out a trembling sob when I heard my wife's soft voice. "John." I heard her get up and walk towards the bed. Her hand found mine and hugged it. I heard her soft sobs as she stroked my cheek with her other hand. I didn't say anything. "Oh, John, thank God you're here. I was so worried. I prayed and hoped that you were alive and would come back to me, to the girls." Her voice trembled with tears. I still hadn't said a word when she leaned over and kissed me first on the forehead and then on the lips. Feeling her tender lips on my cracked and broken lips, I could not stand it. My arms wrapped around her fragile body, pressing her to me. I groaned in pain as she pressed herself against my injured ribs, and she tried to pull away, saying, "Oh God, I'm sorry, I forgot you were in pain." I didn't let her go. After enduring the pain, I held her and cried. Maybe it was the drugs, maybe it was the release of all the pent-up emotions, or maybe it was the realization of how close I was to death. But I couldn't let her go. I couldn't let her go. "Joanna, I missed you so much." I felt her fingers gently run over my cheeks, wiping away my tears. Through her own tears falling down my face, she said, "God, John, I can't even express how sorry I am, how ashamed I am of what I did. I cannot even hope to ask you for love and forgiveness. I can only hope that you won't give up on me, on us." Crying, she finally pulled away, but continued to hold my hands in hers. "John, you need to rest." I tried to hold her, not allowing her to move away. "Don't worry. I'll be here in the morning. Girls will want to see you too. Just rest." I sighed and soon fell into a strange sleep. To be continued. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. She will be there very soon. The link to the sequel will be in the description of this video below. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.